Hello and welcome to another Financial Director web seminar sponsored by Aon. Today we're discussing pension management and how to get the most out of your time and budget. I'm joined by Aon partner James Patton and PI Pension Trustees Head of Trusteeship Roger Cooper. Welcome to you both. Just a little housekeeping before we get underway. You, the audience, can ask and submit questions you'd like answered via the eponymous link on the site. Roger, if we could start with you. What does a well-managed pension scheme look like?
Well, I think a well-managed scheme is about how the trustees function. I think a trustee board should be engaged and work collaboratively to make decisions and be equipped and feel empowered to make those decisions. And I think it's about how that trustee team interacts with its advisory team. I think that personally to me is key, and that they have the ability to separate the strategic decisions they have to take from the operational decisions and the day-to-day implementation. So I think an effective trustee board is one that is commercial and business-like in the way it does things. And having taken the decision to delegate implementation, I think that's fundamental, is able and willing to oversee that delegation. I think you agree, James?
Yeah, I would. And you've mentioned there the importance of the relationships between the trustees and with their advisors, but there's another really key relationship, which is that relationship between the trustee chair and the company representatives, and often that means the FD. It's so important that those parties are aligned to a long-term goal, because if they aren't aligned, then over the years there's always going to be fighting at the wheel. Once those long-term objectives are aligned, that can drive short-term actions that can be agreed between the FD and the trustees and really deliver some tangible results.
Obviously the market's fairly fast moving, and particularly in recent years, keeping abreast of that and spotting opportunities must be pivotal. Is that something you'd echo, Roger?
Well, absolutely. I think, just picking up James's point, actually, I just wanted to say that I think you've got to recognise the importance of that finance director and trustee relationship, because it's about, you've got after all the shared objective, which is to deliver benefits to members, and the sponsor wants to see that delivery, the deficit recovery contributions they're paying if it's a defined benefit plan, not being diluted by the trustees being ineffective as a board, and I think that's fundamental. In terms of spotting opportunities and responding to market change, trustees are faced with a whole plethora of new investment techniques and solutions that are before them. So that's one example of an area where I think recent changes and trends are an example of where trustees can really benefit from effective delegation and effective use of their time. And what we're seeing is much more a move into fiduciary management or delegated investment management, which enables trustees to focus on strategy, not being inhibited with all the day-to-day implementation. And that effective delegation ensures that when markets are right, that the scheme is able to take the benefit of opportunities as they present themselves. And I'd say that delegation extends into other areas. James, you probably want to comment on that.
Yeah, I would do, and I'd agree with that. I mean, I think just before going on to that, coming back to fiduciary management, let's just say here, fiduciary management isn't right for all trustee boards. There are some trustee boards that can take advantage of market opportunities, getting busy, possibly with an investment subcommittee that has trustees dedicated to learning about complex investment instruments, working closely with their advisors, and being able to convene meetings quickly to make that work. But for those with the lower governance budgets who don't really have the time to do that, may not have the personnel to do that, for them, fiduciary investment management might be more appropriate. Now, similarly, when we look at other areas, coming back to Roger's point, again, for some trustee boards with lower governance budgets, there might be another way forward. Rather than possibly spending a lot of time sort of spending time with advisors, listening to recommendations, considering them, reflecting on them a bit more, and then ultimately potentially asking the advisors to then go ahead and implement them. There'll be others out there, other trustee boards, where actually, given their governance budgets, they'd rather possibly delegate more responsibility to the advisors to go away, consider their recommendations, and rather than coming back to the trustee board, potentially going away and actually putting them into action, executing them for lower level decisions. But of course that needs appropriate checks and balances and appropriate reporting back to the trustees to make sure that works. Now at Aon, that's something we're doing right now. We're launching our new implemented consulting service that does just that.
Okay, yeah, and so there are risks inherent to that delegation and seeking out new market opportunities. Presumably, though, there's a risk in being a bit too averse to that as well.
Yes, it can mean that opportunities are missed. So, a good example of that would be, let's say, medically underwritten annuities, a current hot topic. Some trustee boards may have such a packed agenda that when a new opportunity like that comes along, they just don't have sufficient time to actually be able to consider this. Yeah. Now, delegation of some of the actions to an advisor should hopefully free up time to spend on strategic issues, and also allow some specific time on the trustee agenda to consider new opportunities as well. It really just elevates their role to that of a director, so they're really considering what matters.
Yeah, it's probably worth me just picking up that point, James, because I think good agenda design is fundamental to this, and that the trustees know when they're in a meeting, when they're being just simply shared with some information's being shared with them, or when they've actually got to take a decision and what they need to be able to take an informed decision in that space. And also, importantly, when to consult with their sponsor, because I think early consultation, particularly where a decision may have a major impact on a transaction, for example, that early consultation is important, so you work collaboratively. And I think there are two responsibilities here. It's about distilling the information that's before them, and this is the trustees being able to make it, to follow and respond to that, the advice they receive. I think the two responsibilities are that advisors are able to highlight what is important to the trustees and not just labour through a report which could have been read in advance of the meeting and questions raised. I think that's an effective way of using that meeting time. I think there's a responsibility on the trustees' part to actually put in the effort to read the papers and raise those questions in advance, so that you really use the meeting and focus the meeting on doing something that makes a difference.
Yeah, and I'd add to that as well. I think it's also important for advisors to actually instill trust as well, and show that they can be trusted if the trustees are going to be delegating more responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's about efficient decision making, but and having become abreast of the information prior to the meeting, rather than leafing through huge tomes of documents. But that's surely something that it still happens. So what are the impediments to making the switch? It sounds like a cultural one.
That's an interesting question. So maybe culture's part of that. I think trust is an absolute key issue. But let's also not forget, this is not potentially a solution for all trustees or all sponsors, but it just might be useful for those with lower governance budgets. What I would say that I think is applicable to many more schemes is that on any trustee agenda right now, trustees do have quite a lot on their plate because of a huge amount of legislation. Now, when you look through the trustee agenda, for some trustees, they might well have some lower level delivery items that they're spending quite a bit of time on. So, for example, to Roger's point, the administration report some trustees might have a presentation for 30 minutes from the administrator when actually it's possible to have read through that beforehand, and then just ask the administrator to highlight what are the key points, is there anything we need to be aware of. So trustees might spend less time on some of those lower level delivery items and focus more of their agenda on the strategic issues.
Well, it comes back to your point about using subcommittees and delegating certain aspects of that day-to-day governance to outside a meeting. It doesn't have to be done at the trustee table, because it's not getting back to the strategic stuff.
It's about remembering that trustees are volunteering their time, and really it's about making the most of that time that is volunteered as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so where does the FD fit into all this? I mean, I have heard that these meetings can take a full day, and FDs are busy people. So.
Well, from the FD's perspective, where does this come in? Well, firstly, as a corporate pensions advisor myself, I know a lot of FDs would like to control the amount of time spent on pensions, as sometimes it can be viewed as a business distraction, and this will help. It will help the trustees focus on the tangible results with their time. From the perspective of fees, it may well be that in some cases this can actually help reduce some of those fees. And then from the perspective as well directly around implementation of corporate projects, I find that sometimes FDs can end up being sort of sucked in to the execution of a project and have to be approached on certain lower level decisions along the way. Now, something, as I say, we're developing with this implemented consulting service is an approach whereby corporate companies might delegate responsibility for those lower level decisions to the corporate advisor to free up their time, so that they're just focused on the strategy, having agreed the highest level parameters on the project.
Yeah. I mean, I think that applies equally to trustees in terms of their delegation, and that comes back to the point about scope, clear scope when commissioning work from advisors. I think that's fundamental, and it's at the planning stage. Implementation, you should try and preempt as many of the hiccups that you'll face and the challenges you'll face. You won't cover all of them, but have a clear mandate as to who's doing what.
Exactly.
Who's accountable.
I mean, these are, primarily, those are time related, but I mean, presumably it has an impact on budgets. I mean, Roger, what are the pain points you've encountered in your role that can cost time and ultimately hurt budgets too?
Okay, well, I'd like to think I don't have too many if I'm a good chair, but we're not perfect. So I think it's about being constantly alert to making sure, one, that when you have a busy agenda, that it doesn't swamp the important decisions you've got to take. It comes back to the design of the agenda. It's about clarity of the decision you take, that the trustees are very clear when they've taken a decision what it actually is, and they've got a good audit trail to show what that decision was. Commissioning work, that you have a clear mandate for your advisor and a clear budget for them to work to, because it all comes back to being commercial. And engage with the sponsor. How many buyout deals have failed because the sponsor hasn't been involved through the process from the start to the end? That is just wasted time and effort. So, and I think important is that there be a culture between the relationship within the trustee board and the sponsor that facilitates that engagement, an early engagement. And I would say also, I think a really key point for the trustees is having a good secretary who works collaboratively and effectively with the trustee chair to just make things, to help orchestrate things in a successful way. I think that makes such a difference.
James, is that something you'd echo? What's your experience of these issues?
Yeah, Roger mentioned in particular one point that really resonated with me, which was, again, coming back to that relationship between the company and the trustee chairman. Commonly that's the FD and the trustee chairman. I think it's so helpful when there's that strong relationship and the FD and trustee chairman can perhaps sit down before the start of a scheme year or company year and plan out what actions are we going to take over the course of the year. And that will help to then inform a budget for the advisors. And once all those budgets are in, again, I think it's appropriate for the FD and trustee chairman to sit down, see how that corresponds with how much the company actually wants to spend on pensions, and then decide, well, actually, if there is a gap, where do we best spend our money? Where are we going to get the best bang from the buck?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually to revisit what you've agreed to do and monitor it and recalibrate going forward. I think, you know, it's good to have a plan, but you want to monitor that plan and review how well you've done and see how that impacts things going forward.
Yeah,
I think it's key.
So ultimately, what should FDs and CFOs be taking from that? They should. It's about cultivating the relationship that exists between.
I think that's right. It's so important there's a strong, close relationship between FDs and trustee chairs. I think having a regular dialogue is absolutely key to that.
Yeah, I mean, what I think that does, it helps both parties. It helps the trustees understand the FD's perspective and what the FD and the business's plans are and how what they're doing as trustees impacts that. But I think for the FD, it helps the FD see the trustees' perspective as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, after all, the trustees have the responsibility for delivering the benefits. You know, and it's got to be a shared collaborative approach. It comes back to the point right at the start. You know, it's the finance director, it's the business's legacy that's being managed here, and the trustees and finance director need to work together.
Yeah, very much so.
You've spoken about defined benefit, but this also applies to defined contribution, doesn't it, as well? All of this.
Yeah, I think when it comes to DC, there are similar things to be said there. One particularly interesting point in terms of DC that I'm seeing with corporates right now is many are starting to consider whether their current occupational trust arrangements remain the right vehicle for them. There's an increasing amount of regulation being placed on trust-based DC arrangements right now, and some FDs have actually taken a view, well, yes, that works. Others are actually becoming a view, well, actually, maybe we should look at that again. Some are looking in particular at at master trusts, which are really coming to the fore right now as a way to sort of outsource the governance responsibilities associated with some of that regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. These issues, the principles we've been talking about, apply equally to DC. I think defined contribution, the market is changing. It's beholden on the trustees to deliver defined contribution benefits effectively for the sponsor, because the sponsor wants to know the money they're paying in is being used for the purpose that it's intended. I think as a chair of trustees, I'm going to have to start signing my chair's statement that our scheme offers value for money, very subjective definition as to what's value for money. To be able to do that, I need to be confident that we are doing our best to give value for money for members. And I think we'll see quite a wholesale shift from own trust DC delivery to other ways of delivering DC in the future. That's a topic for another debate, I think.
Okay, well, we're fast approaching the end of our allocated time. All that remains for me is to thank our panel, Roger Cooper from High Trustees and James Patton from Aon. Thanks for joining us today. And join us next time. Goodbye.